Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. My guest for this program is, once again, Frank Feschino. Frank and I have been going into it on the Flatwoods Monster case. Actually, for our first interview, we discussed the unbelievable and necessary prequel, I guess we could say, for the Flatwoods Monster case of September 12, 1952. And by that, I simply mean Frank gave an incredible amount of background on the entire shoot them down environment that was in place by the United States during 1952, including the outfitting of U.S. aircraft with rockets to shoot these things down. And we went into the case of the missing pilot and his radar man that Frank and Frank alone uncovered, and this was all connected to the Flatwoods mystery as well. Just an incredible story. But we're back, and we're going to talk about the Flatwoods Monster case itself. Frank, welcome back for part 2.
Hey, Richard, how are you?
Happy to be doing this.
All right.
So, yeah, let's, the case itself in the public eye is kind of bizarre because it's got this image of what looks like a kind of bizarre robot with a weird sort of curtain apparatus, and he's 12 feet tall, and people are thinking, what is this all about? And it's in West Virginia, and there's all of this bias and prejudice against the folks up there thinking, well, what do they know? They just got excited. They saw an owl. They saw a meteor. And the whole thing got kind of dismissed and laughed off. And that's actually the exact wrong attitude to take about this case, and you, of all people, know that.
Absolutely, Richard. The claw-waving monster. That's what this thing was billed as, a claw-waving monster. A bunch of hillbilly kids made a misinterpretation, and they saw this owl in a tree, which is ridiculous because these kids grew up there, and they knew these mountains and the woods like the back of their hand.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting, what really got me rolling into this, Richard, to be honest, after I interviewed Mrs. May, who was the primary witness who led the group of boys up there, she said to me, Frank, you got to talk to Dale Levitt.
Mm-hmm.
I said, who's Dale Levitt? She said he was the West Virginia National Guard commander at the time of the Flatwoods Incident, and he was up there for crowd control.
Interesting.
Because there were people that were coming in from all over, literally from all over the world.
Uh-huh.
It was estimated that 10,000 people were in Flatwoods within the first month. Flatwoods has got 300 people. If you blink, you drive through it. That's a lot of people that came into that town and basically trampled the hell out of it.
That's incredible.
Mrs. May didn't sleep for weeks, she told me. Now, Mrs. May was a great woman. She had a lot of moxie, Richard, because she stood up with the press and even the locals who made fun of her.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started showing her the interest and articles from all over the world, and as I said in the last show, the different information that I pulled out of the government files, she was amazed.
Right.
Well, when she said to me, you got to talk to Dale Levitt, she said he was up here for crowd control. That's how many people were there.
I see.
And then she says, no, Richard, it's funny. I can remember her saying this years ago. She says, no, you better let me call him up first. He might not talk to you because I'm an outsider.
Right.
So she called him up, and she called me back. And long story short, I met Colonel Levitt. And the first time I met Levitt, I was with my mom. We were up visiting my cousin in Braxton County in Frametown. And we actually picked Dale up. We went over and we had breakfast, and we took him up to the farm. He would not let me tape record him, and I was loaded for bear. I was disappointed.
Right, of course.
But I knew at least I could get him to talk. Well, within the first few minutes, Richard, I found out that he was not just up there for crowd control in the following weeks. He was actually up there that night, and he was up there with his troops. He was up there with 180 men, and 180 people. There was about 50 to 60 that went to Flatwoods. There was another UFO that crashed down the Elk River, about 17, 18 miles away. Dale went there with his troops, set up. He broke away with a truck full of guys, and this contingent came up to Flatwoods. And he's telling me all of this stuff. And Richard, I'm falling over. I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, he ended up, he came in the back row, because what really got me is, how did Mrs. May and the kids in the town not know that he was up there? Because the May house was only just a short distance away from the crash site where this thing went down.
Right,
well,
good
Levitt
question.
told me he came in through the logging road, which was on the north side Covert mission. They were smart. They didn't come piling up Depot Street where everybody in town was going to see him. They came up the back road, and they set up camp there. And he's telling me all of this detail, Richard.
Well, I wonder if you can walk us through an actual timeline of what really happened for this event, and we can include Levitt and his contribution in here. But I'm curious. I think let's just go into the truth, not what the Air Force said and not what the media said, but what actually happened. I know that there were boys out, they were playing, and they saw something go across the sky, and they got a pretty good look at it, and they went up after this, and that's what started the whole thing. But can you set the stage and describe it step by step, what actually happened with this incredible case?
Sure. Well, after the object passed over Washington, it flew about 200 miles west. It was sighted over Virginia and portions of West Virginia. It headed into northern Braxton County, made a 45-degree angle, and it headed south. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at a map, an important part here, Richard, is that Flatwoods is the geographical center of West Virginia, and it is void of any Air Force or military installations. So this, which is what I believe through my research, it was a predetermined area where this thing went down. It didn't land in the middle of Air Force base, near Air Force bases. It landed in the middle of the woods, up on a mountaintop. When it hit northern Braxton County, it made a 45-degree angle turn, and it actually followed State Route 4. And this is interesting because it actually followed the highway, and which is void of mountains, because this thing was flying erratic. There was pieces coming off of it. It was heard making noises. And when it flew over the area of Burnsville, that's where it headed south.
Okay.
And I have witnesses who saw this thing flying at treetop level. It flew into the Flatwoods area, and it flew over the Flatwoods Elementary School. And there was a bunch of kids playing there that night. And it was somewhere around 7:30. And the kids look up, and they see this thing coming over the mountaintop from the north. And their jaws dropped. And here's this big thing flying directly over their heads. It made a 45-degree angle turn, and it flew across the road up onto the Bailey Fisher farm.
Now, before you go any further, you spoke with at least one or maybe more than one of those witnesses, didn't you?
Yeah, quite a few of them.
Right, and
Quite
they were, and how would
the
how
one
would
who
they
worked
describe
with
it?
me the most was Freddie May. I've met several of them, but I worked real close with Freddie.
And how did he describe this?
Freddie was actually at the school playground, and he saw the monster as well.
Right.
And I actually went to the school playground with Freddie years ago, and I interviewed him, and we went step by step. And the kids looked up, and they saw this gigantic thing flying over the school playground, and it turned. It slowed down, and it had flames coming off of it. The thing was damaged, and it flew across the road, and it went up onto a plateau area called the Fisher Farm. And Freddie said some of the kids thought it was a flying saucer. Some of the younger kids said it was a meteor. They didn't know what the hell it was.
Right.
So they all dropped their equipment, whatever they had. They dropped the ball. They all start running up the street, and they head up the road to the house of Kathleen May, and she lived on Depot Street. And they all come busting into the door. Gene Lemon, who was with the kids, 18-year-old. He was a National Guardsman. That was Mrs. May's first cousin.
Mm-hmm.
All the boys come piling in, and they say, Kathleen, something landed up on the back hill. Now, her property basically borders the Bailey Fisher Farm. It's a dead-end road. The train depot is down front at State Route 4, and the road cuts up behind it. It turns left, and that's where Kathleen's house is. Off into the back, which basically would be the backyard, is where the thing touched down.
Okay.
All the boys are in there screaming. They want to go up and see what it was. Kathleen was a beautician. She had just got home from work. Here's all the kids excited. Some of the kids chickened out, for lack of better words, and didn't want to go up there. They saw this thing, and on second thought, they ended up leaving and going home. And I talked to two of those kids.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, over the years, and one of them said it was probably the biggest disappointment of his life, because he had a chance to see the monster, and he chickened out when he ran home to Shaversville.
Yep.
But Gene Lemon and Kathleen are there now, them basically being the two adults. Each one of them grabbed a flashlight. There was a dog that accompanied the May family, and it was Freddie May's dog. This dog followed the group, and another kid had joined the group. He was Tommy Heyer. He was a little 6-year-old kid. So by the time all in all is done, there's 8 kids up there.
And most of them are, most of them are actually old enough easily to know what's happening. You've got Kathleen May. She's an adult. You've got Gene Lemon. He's 18 years old and very responsible.
Right.
And a bunch of other younger kids who are like 13, 14.
14, yeah. 13 years old, 11, 10, and 6.
Yeah.
So you have this group going up there, and these, like I said earlier, Richard, these kids grew up in there. You know, not like a lot of the city kids today walking around with their cell phones. That's all these kids did, was play outside and play in the woods and play cowboys and Indians and army. So they knew every inch of this property in that area.
Sure.
So they take off, and they go up onto this back part of the farm. And here's an important part, Richard, the layout of this farm. There are actually 3 fields. The first field, which borders the property, that's a wide open field. The second field, there's a big gully, and it's a big sloping area. And in the far back of this gully, there were some trees, different fruit trees. The third field is where they saw this thing touch down, which is way out in the back. And it's actually a plateau. It's not a mountain with a point. It's a flat plateau. It's approximately the size of a football field where this thing touched down. So they're going up. They cross onto the property. They're walking, and they take a left at 45 degrees. They walk up the path, and they go into the area where it's a cow. There's cows set up, and there was horses in there. They all get up to this big gate, and they open the gate up, and they pass through the gate. They wired it back closed. In the meantime, there was a German Shepherd dog from the neighborhood who had joined them. So you have May, all the boys, a German Shepherd, and you have the May family dog, which was a little dog.
Okay.
They're walking up along the path. Okay, now this was called the wagon trail, Richard. Okay, it was like a wagon path. It was dirt. To the left is the woods. To the right is the gully.
Yeah.
They're looking way the heck back there to see where this thing touched down up on the top of this plateau. Over to the left-hand side where the woods are, they see something up ahead, and it's a fog that's rolling down the hill, and it smells like sulfur. It's kind of a burning. It was penetrating their nose.
Okay.
So they start going around this little swag, as Mrs. May called it. It's this little swag. They reach another fence, which was basically pillar to post. This was just an area where they had to cross over, and it was a wooden gate. It was just nailed shut. They started climbing over this gate. As they got up a little bit further, they noticed the smell was starting to be a little bit stronger. I said German Shepherd before. It was actually a collie. This collie darted out in front of them, and it ran around this swag, and it disappeared, and it went into this low-laying fog, Richard. And the thing started carrying on up a racket, and it ended up, it yelped, it barked, and it turned around, and Mrs. May told me it ran back like a flash of lightning. It ran back towards the house. Mm-hmm. At that point, some of the kids had went forward over this wooden fence. You had Mrs. May, Lemon, Neil Nunley, the older boy, Eddie, and Ronnie Shaver. They went forward. Freddie May, Teddy Neal, and little Tommy were at that gate at the point where Mrs. May got up to the tree. Now, this tree to the left was over 100 feet tall, and it was an oak tree. It's set back
100. That's huge. That's massive.
Yeah, it's a big giant tree.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's set back on an incline about 5 feet. Okay, it's not level with the path. It goes up about 4 or 5 feet. And this big tree, this is the area where this smell and this low-laying fog is emanating from. Now, Mrs. May told me when she got up to that point there, it was starting to get dark. And her and Lemon were carrying the flashlights. They were leading the path. You always have 2 flashlights, they told me, in case one battery goes dead. You always got 2 flashlights.
Good idea.
So Freddie May, who I worked very close with, he was at the fence ready to climb over it. So he saw the view from a distance as it unfolded. What happened is Mrs. May said she heard this noise that sounded like thumping bacon, frying bacon and thumping noise. It was like a rhythmic, like hitting a conga drum. And this frying noise, and she said it was like grease and oil, bacon.
So it's like a sizzling sound, kind of?
Yeah, and she said she had no idea what it was. And she's hearing this thumping noise, and as they got closer to the tree, this sulfur gas stuff is starting to get stronger, and it's billowing and rolling down the hill. And Jean Lemon and Kathleen were the 2 closest at this point. And Neil Nunley, the other older kid standing behind them, they looked up to the left, and right at the perimeter of the tree line, they looked up approximately 12 feet in the air, and they saw these 2 reddish glowing eyes. And they thought it was an owl or a raccoon perched up in a tree. And they're looking at this thing, and simultaneously Kathleen and Jean flashed their flashlight up at it. They wanted to see what it was, because it's starting to get dark. And Mrs. May said that the second she flashed this beam of light and it hit it, the thing lit up. And it was a giant metallic structure. And it wasn't an animal, it wasn't an owl, it wasn't this or that. She said it was a metallic structure.
And also, if I'm remembering you correctly on this, it wasn't in the tree, it was just to the side of the tree, wasn't it?
Right. It was basically hiding, Richard.
Yeah.
It was off to the side of it. That's why they didn't see it at first, until they almost got right next to it. And I said, Kathleen, how close were you to this damn thing? She said, as close as a car, the length of a small car. You're talking like, a Subaru or a Volkswagen. She was within a few feet because it was to their left. They didn't see it till they were almost on top of it.
Yeah, maybe like 10, 15 feet at the most, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and this thing actually lifted, and it made a noise, and it lifted up into the air. What it was, Richard, it was a propulsion system. Mm-hmm. And as this structure lifted up, it coasted down that little incline, went in front of the dirt path, and Mrs. May said it was leaking and spurting this oil out.
But it was floating then, right?
Yeah, it was actually hovering.
Right.
And from working with her and Freddie sat down with me, and he did a drawing, and he believes that the source of the sulfur and smoky stuff that was coming down the path was actually part of the propulsion system, or the exhaust system, because this thing was hovering. It hovered, it came down the incline, it went right in front of him. Mrs. May said Gene's knees just got wobbly. He almost, he did hit the ground. He almost passed out from fright. This thing came right across in front of him within a few feet. It went to the right, and they all got a good look at this thing. And Mrs. May said that it reacted to him. And I was very adamant about finding out when this thing lit up. She said it glowed from the inside. And we're talking with Freddie over the years, one of the analogies he gave me is the way this thing lit up is getting into your car at night and you put your key in the ignition, and when you turn it on, your dashboard lights start glowing, orange or blue. And he said that's what it looked like. It like glowed from the inside, like somebody turned the key on and started this thing up, you know what I mean, Richard? And it lifted. And the beams of light that actually came out from the eye area were actually porthole openings. Freddie said it was like looking at a house across the street at your neighbor's house at night, where you could see that orange yellowish glow. And the thing was actually, it was some type of an inner helmet with an outer helmet, and Freddie and Kathleen both told me it was some type of a protective piece of glass, like plexiglass, in front of this thing. And talking with Freddie a couple of years after, and Richard, I want to bring the point up, I worked with these witnesses and interviewed them hundreds of times. It wasn't I went and I interviewed Mrs. May once or Freddie or talked to them. I talked to these people for years. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, I went and did one interview and I went home.
Right.
Because as I would talk to them, I would do drawings, I would do composites, sketches, and I wanted to see what this thing really looked like, because what the show portrayed was a joke. And being a trained illustrator, I was able to sit down with them.
When you say the show, do you mean the original TV show? Or?
Yeah, the We the People TV show.
Right.
They had it as a claw-waving monster wearing a dress.
Right.
What the dress interpretation of the artist, Mrs. May was explaining what the lower torso looked like, and it was flared out, and she was trying to describe the pleats of a dress or the drapes in her windows, the way they hang and they roll down and they're evenly spaced.
Right.
So he took it literally and drew the monster in a dress.
Mm-hmm.
Freddie May sat down with me, and Richard, I remember he held his arm out straight in front of him, and he said, "Frank, see my forearm?" He said that thing had pipes going around the lower circumference, equally spaced, and they were as thick as my forearm.
Wow.
Like a fireman's hose,
Wow.
he said. And then he stood up, and he spread his arms apart, and he said it was about this wide at the base. And it was just 4 to a little bit wider than 4 feet at the base. And he said, and it tapered up towards the shoulder area about 3, just maybe over 3 feet. So, and then it had some type of a pointed outer helmet with this covering, and the red head that was drawn and portrayed in the original drawing in 52,
yeah.
The wrong one, it was actually an inner helmet. And Freddie brought up to me at one point, he says, "Frank, you know what it kind of reminds me of, looking at the head area? It was like a fighter pilot sitting in the cockpit of his plane. The canopy over the top was actually the protective helmet of the Flatwoods Monster, and the pilot sitting inside had his inner helmet on." And that's the analogy he gave. So he said this thing, it was definitely mechanical, and he said this thing was being controlled, the way they saw it and the way it reacted.
Yeah, so what you're really describing, it seems to me, is the description that everyone was drawing. What they were actually seeing was a very involved mechanical suit, protective suit for the actual being that was inside it. And so
Right,
they weren't seeing the being that was some kind of robot. They were seeing a kind of very, very...
probe.
Yes, exactly.
It was some type of a probe.
Right.
And the great part about working with Freddie and Kathleen especially is Kathleen was right there. She saw up close and personal, so she gave me some nice close details of the way this thing looked. Freddie was standing approximately 60 feet back, ready to go over the fence, so he saw the whole thing unfold in front of him. You know what I mean, Richard? So I have 2 points of view, and then I talked with the other witnesses who collaborated this, and that's how I was able to come up with this Flatwoods Monster was actually some type of a mechanical device.
But don't you think, wasn't there something in there, though, Frank, or was there not? I mean, when you say a probe, that makes me think there wasn't an actual being in there, but I had the feeling that there probably was a being in there, or do you think that's wrong?
No, absolutely right. There was something in there because when I went a little bit further researching this, I found an article, a portion of an article in an old UFO book, Richard, and it talked about the Frametown Monster.
Right.
And it was a monster that was seen 17 miles away. And it happened 24 hours later after the Flatwoods incident. And what that was all about, Richard, there's not much. Back in the day when I was researching in the 90s, there wasn't anything except like a little short paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that, and you talk about being guided, how this thing has unfolded over the years.
Right.
I went to a MegaCon convention years ago. It was a big comic MegaCon type show. And I was walking around the show, and there was a guy from New Jersey there who had hundreds of old magazines. And I said to him, do you happen to have any of the 1955, it was called Male, M-A-L-E, it was like a hunting and fishing, and it was all manly stuff, you know, safaris. And this article actually in full appeared in that magazine.
On the Frametown event.
Yeah, that this Natowski Frametown Monster. But I was unable to find it. Well, this one show in Orlando that I just happened to be at, hell's luck, the guy says that Richard is funny. I remember him saying, probably not, because 99 out of 100 people who are looking for a goddamn article, I never have it. And he says, well, let me take a look. And he went through his box and he pulled it out. Richard, I almost had a heart attack.
Well, this leads us to a whole other case. Do we want to get to that now, or do we want to wait?
Well, this is the Frametown Monster.
Exactly.
This is the case, but there was nothing ever known about it, Richard.
No.
Except a little paragraph synopsis in a book. When that guy pulled that out of the box and I opened it up out of the plastic, it was the full-blown article as it was described in 1955.
No, it's interesting because this is a case no one, as you said, knew about it. It's clearly connected to the Flatwoods case of the day before, right?
Exactly.
It's the same thing. And no, I think we need to talk about it. I just wondered if there was still more we wanted to say about the Flatwoods case first before we got to the Frametown case, or do you want to talk about Frametown now? Either way with me.
Well, we'll make the comparisons here. Well, I didn't know anything about this case except that little paragraph synopsis, Richard.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the gold mine. I saw that article, and it was like the full-blown article. I was able to read exactly what happened. Paul Lieb had actually done an interview with George Natowski, who was the primary witness in this case, and it happened 24 hours later, 17 miles away.
And it's important to point out there was no publicity yet on the Flatwoods case, right?
Right, exactly. Okay. At the time this sighting happened, there was only pieces that the press had released about unknown objects, meteors, strange things and lights in the sky. So I got this article, I came home, and I looked this guy up, and I found him. He's passed away since, George Natowski, and I had somebody do a private search, and I got their telephone number, and I called him in New York.
Great.
And I spoke to him on the phone. He was very hesitant at first. All of these years later, he's like, what the, you know, you can imagine this guy, some guy cold calls him, you know, what the hell is this guy? And I told him, I have your article here. And he says, I'm going to tell you one thing. Everything in there was the honest to God's truth.
How about
That
that?
happened as it did.
Mm.
And it was basically what he had seen was the Flatwoods Monster with the upper portion of its suit removed.
Exactly.
And this was 24 hours later. He was driving back to New York and from Ohio after a vacation, and his car stalled. And it was on the side of the road, and he jumped out, and he went to check his battery because it just went poof. It just died like that. Their 18-month-old baby was in the back seat. He gets out, and he looks out in the distance, and he sees this thing glowing out in the distance. It's like a purplish orb, and it's bouncing around. And I said to myself, wow, when Mrs. May, one of the times I talked to her, she said she remembers seeing a big purplish flare when she was walking up the hill right before the encounter out in the distance. So I'm going, same color, same color. George Santowski started noticing this rancid sulfur smell. The fog rolling around. I'm like, there's a lot of things that are the same in this case. Well, Santowski started walking towards this orb thing out in the distance off the side of the road. And his wife, who's in the inside of the car with the baby was actually they had cribs back then in the old days, no baby seats. She had grabbed the baby, pulled it with her arms into the front seat. They rolled all the windows up because the whole area is engulfed with this smell.
Mm-hmm.
George is walking towards the woods. His wife, Edith, gives this blood-curdling scream like Fay Ray when she saw King Kong.
Okay.
She's flipping out. She's screaming her head off. George turns around, and he looks into the other direction, and he sees this thing hovering towards him, and quote-unquote, he said it was a good 9 feet tall. And what this thing was, from the waist down, it was the craft with the pipes going around. From the waist up, it looked like some type of a reptilian.
He sees the same thing that Freddie May described to you.
Yeah,
exactly,
right. Except
the same
that the upper portion was off of it.
Exactly.
The upper piece of it was off. So sometime between when this thing, it didn't take off that night from Flatwoods and just disappear. I actually tracked it going into Frametown. So when I, through the local newspapers, the weekly papers gave descriptions, and I tracked it. It actually followed the Elk River into Frametown, and it landed up there in the mountains. And that's when the thing encountered 24 hours later George Santowski. He sees this thing. He ran back to the car, and he's flipping out. He's going crazy. This thing's hovering, and it's chasing him. When he got into the car, the windows were all rolled up, and you can imagine the scene. The baby's crying, she's screaming, he's freaking out. He looked up. He didn't see the thing at first, and it's actually hovering around the car, and the whole area is becoming engulfed with this smell, and they're all choking and gagging. He looked up. They were hiding underneath the dashboard. Those old 50s cars.
His wife and baby.
The big front seats. He has his wife down with the baby. Is the man thing. He tucked his wife away, and he's protecting his family.
Mm-hmm.
And he lifted his head up to see where this thing was. And Richard, imagine this sight. When he lifted his head up to see where it was at the hood of the car looking down on him. That's when he almost lost it. The thing reached down, and it actually touched the hood of the car, and it had 3 fingers. Didn't have a fourth finger, and it didn't have a thumb. The thing was kind of like a snake-looking reptile thing.
Right.
And when it touched the hood of the car, it burned a hole into it, into the paint.
And you did an illustration of that being, that creature.
Yes. Yeah. It was pretty scary looking. But George said that everything that Paul Lee wrote in that original article was true, and basically trying to get a description from him It was some type of a reptilian
So
sneaky
did
looking
you
thing.
did you show him your illustration? Did he look at it and say that's accurate, or did you get a chance to show him?
No, because I did that. I did that later on,
Yeah.
Richard.
Okay.
When I got that article,
Right.
I had the paragraph. Then I found the article. Then I called Snitowski, and I actually mailed a copy of that article to him, where he had to have a signature release.
Okay.
You know,
Right.
he
Right.
got it through the postal service, and he signed it. And I know he got it. But what he told me on the phone, when I wanted to interview him and put this on the record, he said because of his position as a businessman, he said he caught hell back because the article wasn't released until 55, July 1955.
Oh, okay.
He went forward with it 3 years later, and he just caught hell, and they made fun of him. He didn't want to go public with this again.
Right.
He says, I do not. I went to hell with this once before with a baby and my wife. He says, I do not want to go through this, Frank, again. You know, it's like opening up an old wound. But I just wanted to verify that this wasn't some fictionalized crap story.
Yeah.
And he verified it, and he told me. And I even read some of the quotes, and he said everything Paul Lee wrote in that article was absolutely true.
Fascinating. So that's Frametown. That's a really interesting tie-in that no one had done with Flatwoods. And is there anything else you want to say about Flatwoods itself? Because you spent a lot of time talking with Kathleen May and everyone else associated with it. You know, I mean, from what I recall in your treatment of it, when they were coming up and they saw the creature, down to the right, down in that gully area, was actually the landed craft. Did we get a chance to talk about that?
No. What actually happened, Richard, is after this thing touched down on the back part of the farm, and the witnesses told me they saw it. Kathleen didn't see it. She was in the house, but I also spoke to another fellow called Jack Davis, who was a businessman in the area. He saw it from another part of town, and I nailed him, and I witnessed him. And he actually took me up onto another part of the county, and we were driving up through these windy roads. I had no idea where I was, and I'm like, Jack, where are we going? He says, I'm going to show you something, Frank, from a different point of view. We pulled over, and we jumped out onto a farm, and we walked across, and we were miles away from the landing site. And he said, Frank, look out in the distance, right over there to the east. He says, look along the skyline. And this is miles away.
Right.
He said, you're only going to see one little bare patch. And I looked across, and it looked like a bald spot on a man's head, Richard. And I said, there it is. He said, that's where it landed, Frank. There was a reason. It just didn't haphazardly crash out of the sky. That thing landed there. He said, I just want to show you a different point of view because this is what I did back in 52. So I worked with some really cool people. So after this thing touched down, Richard, it actually relocated. Jack Davis told me this thing was glowing day glow, this purplish color, and it was flashing, and you could see it through the woods because once it dropped below the tree line, you could still see it. It actually relocated and went into the gully, which is the second field, and it was up behind the pear trees.
And then the creature clearly left the craft and went up, up the hill.
After it touched down there, it exited the craft, and Ailey Stewart was the first person up there that night. He was called to go up there. The state police actually had him go up there because the police, the sheriff, and the state police were running around Braxton County chasing down calls of crashed airplanes and UFOs. So they had no authority to go up there, so they called Stewart, and he went up there because he worked as a photojournalist and took pictures of crime scenes. So he went up there, and he got a couple of the boys to go up there, and he said one of them was so frightened, he said he was crying like a whipped pup under his breath. He did not want to go back up there to the site to where this happened. When they went up to the site, they were flashing around with what he called electric lanterns, and that's when he saw these big, gigantic marks. They went from the landing site, and they were about 4 feet wide. And Richard, it looked like it was carved out, and it was like holding a leaf blower, and that was actually the area. Once the Flatwoods craft touched down, it cut a path through the high weeds. The weeds were the weeds and grass were like knee to waist high, and this thing, the propulsion system, actually cut a path going through the pasture, up over the dirt path, up to the tree, and when it exited, it followed a parallel path. So you have these two big, gigantic paths going through there. And Stewart was the first one that saw that. When he went back up there the following day, he was the first one on the spot, and he saw this place, the scarred landscape. He was the first person of authority. Mrs. May called the sheriff's department.
I see.
They were unable to respond. And the sheriff's department and the state police department were actually in town hall, and they worked side by side. Nobody could get to the Mays house. That's when they called Stewart up, and Stewart was the first person of authority to get to Mrs. May's house.
All right.
After Stewart left and went home, the National Guard came up there, and that's when Levitt was there just after midnight.
Got it.
And he had 50 to 60 troops. And I asked him, I said, Colonel Levitt, I said, how long were you here on the spot with your troops? And Richard, this floored me. He said, I was here for about 45 minutes. They gathered up samples, some of the oil. There were pieces that looked like black plastic-like pieces that were strewn across the farm, and he says he got some of the leaves and different stuff, gathered it all up. I says, well, what did you do then? He says, well, I was here for 45 minutes, and then I went back down the river with the other fellas. He said, but the rest of the troops stayed here. And I asked him, I says, how long? He said they stayed the night in case something else happened.
So there were many, many people at this scene, investigating, examining, taking evidence. Where did the evidence go? Where did the oil samples go? And do you know what happened to those pieces of physical evidence?
I asked Levitt what happened, and he said he shipped it off to Washington.
Washington,
and I asked
meaning...
him if he ever heard anything back, and he says, no, it was the Air Force. The Air Force is the one that contacted him.
Right.
And he sent all that stuff off. And there's an interesting part here, Richard, which we could kind of close.
Sure.
And this is a real barn burner piece of information that I found out. And it ties into this Burgess case, okay?
The Florida Scoutmaster case, which was, by the way, just a month earlier. In
right.
August 19th, near the
Flatwoods was September 12th.
Right.
Okay. I unearthed a routing and record sheet. Okay. And I'm going to read this for your viewers. The subject is restricted lab analysis of soil samples having possible relation to unidentified flying objects.
Right. And now, just to back up, this is in relation to this Florida case where a scoutmaster was driving home 3 scouts from a scout meeting. They see something off to the side of the road. He wonders, is it a plane going down? There's a glow in the woods. He goes in there and has an experience. And he actually has burns. He's terrified. Local law enforcement arrives after the kids notify them. This is investigated by Project Blue Book. There's actually quite a bit going on with this case. And samples of the ground from his experience were actually taken to Battelle Memorial Institute, which worked with Project Blue Book at Wright Pat, and they did a detailed analysis of the soil and turned up major anomalies. So I just wanted to give people a little bit of a background. for what you're about
And
to
Richard,
say.
wasn't there something where they said he had seen some type of a hideous creature in the turret or something? Is that true? Or
I don't know. I mean, he.
I remember reading an old Keogh article where he talks about there was a hideous creature he saw in the turret at a craft.
Well, the one account that I'm familiar with was he was under it. He saw a craft. It was very well defined. He heard a door closing or opening or closing on the craft, and he sort of blacked out. So I don't know about the creature sighting. Not sure.
Well, this thing here,
Mm-hmm.
headquartered in the United States Air Force, this was a routing and record sheet that went to the Counterintelligence Division Directorate of Special Investigations, okay? And it's dated October 13th. Comment number 1, Major Fournay. It was Dewey Fournay.
Dewey
He
Fournay.
was, Project
Right.
Blue Book Liaison at the Pentagon. Now here, it's from the Topical Division, Deputy Division for Estimates, okay? Written across this thing in big pencil is the word diverges, okay?
Okay.
Now here is the quote. Reference are R&R dated 5 September 1952. Same subject as above. Recent developments have prompted the attachment of increased importance of these samples, specifically a deposit seeming to have the general same characteristics and also related to a flying object has been reported from Flatwoods, West Virginia. In view of this possible relationship and the necessity for a prompt analysis of these two incidents, it is requested that the utmost priority be given to the lab analysis of subject samples. Signed, William A. Adams. So both of these cases were taken very seriously, and they wanted to do a cross-examination of the comparison. So the samples that Levitt did send off did reach the proper channels, and they were actually comparing this Vergis case with Flatwoods and the similarities between them.
That's fascinating, Frank. No one knew that. No one knew that.
I dug up at the last portion. Somebody helped me get some of this research done, and that was put in the new updated and revised book.
Good. You know what's amazing? This case that you have devoted your life to, all right, happened in 1952. That's 66, almost 67 years ago. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it was written about at the time and then faded into the memory hole of our entire society. A very few people kept it alive, talked about it in some books, but they didn't get it right. And it took your dedication and persistence. I mean, my God, man, insane persistence, if I may say. And you just stayed with it. And you have now gotten to the point where this story is fleshed out in a way that's makes it really one of the most significant UFO stories that we have. And it's just, what's odd is how it's got this very odd reputation where it just seems too ridiculous to be true. But part of the reason for that is that it's taken completely out of context of the true story.
And it's still talked about as a folklore tale. Even today, up there, even some of the locals still think of it as a joke and a folklore. But it's like this old Stanton Friedman adage, don't bother me with the facts, my mind is already made up.
It's true. I drove through Braxton County and Flatwoods a little over a year ago with Tracy. We were on a long drive, and we stopped. I spent the night there. We slept over there. And there's, as you know, there's a very small, a tiny little kind of commemoration of the event. And you can sit in this big chair that's sort of dedicated to the Flatwoods Monster. And they've got a little like museum shop. It's tiny. It's very tiny. And your books are there. So that's good. But it's just a very small little thing. Like, this is not like what Roswell's done, or McMinnville, Oregon has their own kind of commemoration. Exeter, New Hampshire's got theirs of their event. The Flatwoods case really hasn't gotten that. But the fact is, this case is as big as any of them. I would almost say it's at the level of a Roswell, except it's not nearly well as known. But what you've done is unpacked something that is absolutely extraordinary, I have to say.
Well, some of my research is in right now. It's being put together where I held some of the original conferences in Flatwoods, and I did the 50th anniversary thing up there, and a few other guest appearances with Kathleen May and the witnesses.
Right.
That's owned by John Cleiss. His mother, Peggy Cleiss, was the former mayor of Flatwoods for years.
Okay.
And they have one of the original, it's called Granddad's Store. It's called something else now. But anyways, that is right next to the school playground where the UFO actually flew right over that building in the playground. And John Cleiss is starting to put together a museum up there. And he's starting to renovate some of it. So we're working hard at it. And he's got a lot of my original pieces and different stuff. And he's, you can find it on Facebook.
Okay.
There is another Flatwoods Museum, and that's in Sutton, which is the county seat. And that's down the road a few miles. But I've been working specifically with Cleiss family on this. And it's the Flatwoods Green Monster Museum. And if you look it up on Facebook, we update and put some articles on there. So it's kind of fun, but it's still interesting how many people haven't read the book and they still refer to it as folklore. I'm like, by God, look at the background research I've done.
Yeah.
The proof of the monster, Richard, is really in the flight paths and what went on that night, not Flatwoods, because that's where the nuts of the story is.
Well,
right there. My best information came from Project Blue Book.
Right. And we talked about this in the previous interview, but just once again to reiterate, it might be a good idea if you just explain this. You tracked through the Blue Book files, which were not available, generally speaking. You went into those and saw that at the time, just before the actual sighting of the event in Flatwoods, West Virginia, there were 3 different UFOs tracked from the Atlantic Ocean going west across the eastern U.S., one of which was the Flatwoods case. And at the same time, activity going on in the south, in Florida, which involved the scrambling of an F-94 and involved the loss of the 2 men, the pilot and the radar operator, on that craft, which you independently, separately hunted all of that down, got the whole story to that. That's all part of the same night. And it's just an incredible story.
That was damaged, that 4th one that came in from the south,
right?
That actually flew into Flatwoods. Now, here's the interesting part. Several of the military people that I worked with, when they looked at this, they were floored because that craft that came up from the Florida area actually hovered over the same damn farm top minutes before the other one. It was a rendezvous point. What I was told is put your damaged craft in the same area so that you got to chase them all over the goddamn mountains. And what happened, Richard? What are the chances that 2 damaged UFOs flew over the same hilltop within minutes of each other? What they did, it was a coordinating effort to rendezvous the 2 heaviest damaged crafts. That craft hovered around the farm. They were actually waiting for the Flatwoods Monster craft to come in. It hadn't arrived yet. What this thing
so the one
that
had come up from
crashed down the river.
The one that had come from Florida went up and was waiting for the Flatwoods craft. So what happened to the original one, the first one that got there?
That thing, it left and it flew and it crashed through Braxton County, and I actually traced it going back out of the southern part of the United States. But what's interesting, Richard, that flew in with 2 wingmates. I tracked all of these things coming up from over North Carolina right to a pin dot coming in. If you look at the master map, it's a little easier to see. It had 2 wingmates. When they headed into Braxton County, they did a grid and search area. This thing hovered over the farm. One went north and one went south. They did U-turns and repeated at low levels, and they came back and they did a sweep. They were actually looking for the Flatwoods Monster craft, and it didn't get in there until about 5 minutes later. They got the hell out of there, split, and went south. A few minutes later, here comes the Flatwoods craft, and it touches down. Mrs. May and the kids saw it. A few minutes later, that took back off. It landed in Frametown.
Mm-hmm.
It stayed there for 24 hours, and that's when the Snitowski family
right.
ran into it.
And then after that, we lose track of it, I guess, or it's just
well,
gone.
Actually, George said that after the encounter, when he saw the thing touch the hood of the car, it circled back around the car and it went out into the woods. And when it went into the woods a few minutes later, he watched, and this thing took off, and it was an oval shape, just like the Flatwoods craft. It took off and shot into the sky, and you very well know about the 1950s UFOs that were seen to make pendulum-like movements.
Mm-hmm.
And it did a pendulum-like movement, and then it shot off like a rocket, and it disappeared.
So clearly, whatever damage it had sustained, it had been able to repair enough to get out.
Right, either that or it was picked up by another craft, and God only knows what happened to the original one. We don't know.
Yeah. Amazing, Frank.
But that's how that story basically ended with Snitowski when he saw this thing take off. And by looking at the master map, Richard, you'll be able to see a little bit clearer, and you could zoom in and you can look around. But basically, long story short, all roads lead to Flatwoods.
It does,
and that
indeed.
was the area where a coordinated effort was to put these damaged craft.
All right, look, well, we've hit the end of this hour, so I want to wrap this up. You and I can keep going. We can do some more chatting about this. But I think this is a good place to wrap it up here, because you've given a very excellent... Have you gotten into this level of detail in many other interviews? I'm just curious.
Not this in-depth.
No.
Because you're very familiar with the story, and it's a lot easier talking with somebody who has the knowledge like you do.
Well, you're the one with the knowledge of this case.
Don't know the story. Well, you know the story. Well, we've met several times.
We have indeed.
At lectures too, and we've talked.
Right. But I just wondered, because really all that I did here, Frank, is I just let you tell the story, interjected once or twice, but this is your research, your knowledge, and it's just an extraordinary series of events. And every bit as extraordinary as the events is your detective work in unwrapping what had been hidden in layer and layer of obfuscation, deception, hidden evidence. And you were able remarkably to put this case together in a way so that the rest of us can at least begin to appreciate what happened. And I really will encourage people to go to your website, flatwoodsmonster.com. That's probably where they should start. Your books, you've got books on this case, by the way, which went through revisions. I have your earlier version, which I discovered from you was not the best. We need the revised, updated, expanded version, which you've got. And then your classic Shoot Them Down, which is also a really fine book.
Well, in closing, Richard, I want to bring up this interesting point in talking about Project Blue Book and intelligence. Intelligence agents actually did go into Flatwoods.
And
they were there from Washington, and they interviewed Mrs. May, and I spoke to her in depth about this, and there's kind of a funny part. Richard, I have to tell this before we get off the air.
Sure.
They went up there on a covert mission, these two fellas, and they were posing as newspaper writers. This was also referenced in one of Kehoe's old books over 60 years ago. Kehoe said that he heard from his sources within the Pentagon that magazine writers went up there and were interviewing witnesses. Now, he wrote that back over 60 years ago. When I interviewed Mrs. May in the mid-'90s, she told me this story in her apartment in Sutton. We were shooting the breeze one day, and she started talking to me about this story with intelligence guys. And long story short, they went up to her, and they were asking her a million questions, and they wanted to know this, that, and the other, and she kind of blew them off.
Okay.
Because she was getting harassed by hundreds of reporters. You
Sure.
can imagine. Everybody wanted to talk to Kathleen. Well, these guys came back the next day, and because Mrs. May was standoffish with them, these fellas told her who they were. They said they were from Washington.
Okay.
And they actually wanted samples that were from her uniform because she got hit with that oil and it splattered across her. Well, she said she was standing in the field out there with Freddie May, and she talked to one of the guys, and she pointed into the direction where the encounter happened. And she said this guy went up there, one of the intelligence guys. She said these guys were dressed to the teeth. They were dressed in suits, and they stood out in Flatwoods, believe me. The guy went up the crest of the hill. He walked into the area of the tree, and Richard, honest to God, I remember sitting there, and Kathleen was sitting in her big, easy Castro convertible, and she leaned forward, and she said, Frank, it was the funniest thing. When he came back, she said he looked like a striped zebra, and she started laughing. And I said, what do you mean by that, a striped zebra, Kathleen? She said where the oil from that Flatwoods machine had splattered throughout the woods where it was sitting, it hit all the tree branches and everything in the woods in that area.
And it got all over his nice suit.
He walked around the tree, it was checking it out. It all went on his expensive suit and his hat. And she says it totally ruined it. And she said he stood there and he held his arms up to the side and he said, I wonder what Ed is going to think about this when we send this in for analysis.
Ed as in Ed Ruppelt, obviously, right?
And and that's the first thing that came to mind. I wonder what Ed's going to think about this when we send these in for analysis.
How about that?
And she was laughing about it. Mrs. May did not know Ed Ruppelt from a hole in the wall.
No, of course not.
And that came into my head, and I went, oh, my God, Ed Ruppelt. And she said, and then they went down to the house, and they wanted to see her uniform, and they took a special little tool out, and they scraped the oil out of her uniform.
What I love about this is all of these little details that you're able to fill into the big picture. And that's just one more. And what we see is intense interest by the U.S. government, U.S. military, Air Force in this event. The fact that they're comparing these samples to the Diverges case in Florida from a month before, it's showing very, very strong interest in the fact that these things were leaving physical evidence that was very interesting to them as well. But there's obviously so much more. Well,
there was a piece of metal that was found by Ailey Stewart on the ground. Mm-hmm. Remember I said earlier, Richard, he was up there that night and he saw all of the area where it was pushed down from the propulsion system.
Right.
And when he told me he was up there, he was waiting. He didn't even go to sleep. He was up all night. And he went up there when the sun came up the following morning. And he walked out, and that's when he saw the scarred landscape, and the sun was gleaming over the hilltops. And he said he was walking through that plowed-out area. And he said that there was stones overturned and rocks. So this thing, you figure, Richard, it was 4 feet wide by about 12 foot high, and it was some type of metallic shell. It had to be heavy, so that thing had a lot of force to propel it across the grass. He said there were just rocks like flipped over, just like nothing. And he said that's when he saw this thing glimmering in the distance, and he walked over and he picked it up, and it was a piece of melted metal. And it was kind of elliptical shape. It was about the size of his thumb, and he said it looked like drip solder. When I was at his house and interviewed him years ago, he drew a picture of it. And in the long run, he said that he had this piece of metal and everybody in town knew about it. And not so good of an idea. He said he went into a local gas station and they put it into a vise with a gasoline blowtorch, and they couldn't melt it. It was melted already, but they couldn't get to melt it.
Shades of Roswell here. That type
And it was confiscated the day before he went on national television with Mrs. May.
Did he ever figure out how it or under what conditions
There were
it was
people who
confiscated?
said they were from the Treasury Department, a guy and a woman. And this is what's kind of funny about it. They went to the house, because he told me, he says everybody knew about it, and the word traveled around. Ailey Stewart's got a piece of this damn metal from the landing site area. And what's odd is it wouldn't melt with a gasoline blowtorch, but he told me he got a pair of snips and he was able to cut it. It would cut, but it wouldn't burn. And he says, I don't know. He says, I don't know, but they were able to cut it because it was kind of thin. And he said, and they took a piece of it. They said they were from the Treasury Department in Washington, D.C.
That makes no sense. I mean, that agency interested in the metal, why would the Treasury Department come, you know?
Yeah, that's what they said. But anyways, he said...
Just a cover.
The next day, when he went back to his house after work, he was writing articles up about the Flatwoods Monster for for all the local papers. Charlton paper was publishing it, so he was busy. When he got back to his house the following day, which was right before he was going to fly to New York with Kathleen and Eugene, the metal was gone. His house was broken into, and he said the balance of the metal was gone. It was stolen from his house.
Fascinating.
And I said, how damn appropriate. The day before he was going on national TV. Could you imagine, Richard?
Right, to show that
metal
on a camera.
Yeah, on camera.
Yeah.
So this was a well-coordinated effort. Another witness I spoke to was very gun-shy about interviewing me. I'm not going to say who it was, but it was one of the kids.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that intelligence came to his house. And he was in the background, and they talked to him through the screen door, and they advised the parents it'd be in your best interest for everybody in the family. Words to that effect if he doesn't talk about this case and do interviews. And he refused to do an interview with me. So they shook everybody up in that little town, and they made their point. But one of the key things that Donald Kehoe brought up, Richard, when he compared the Scoutmaster case in Flatwoods, the Scoutmaster case was investigated publicly, wide open, where Flatwoods was more covert.
And yes, even Kehoe, I remember him writing about this, mentioned this key difference. There was a much greater level of secrecy relating to the Flatwoods case.
Right.
Hey, I want to ask one more thing before we actually close this down, which has to do with the technology of the creature or of the propulsion system that it had. In other words, it's got like oil. And I wouldn't associate splattered oil with the maneuverings of extraterrestrial technology, or is it just my own limitation? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I really had no idea, but I'm going to tell you something that somebody brought up to me on book tour, and this really rocked my world because I had never even thought about this remotely.
Right.
Because I thought the same thing, and everybody's asked me the same question for years.
Right.
Oil, moving gears. And I had a guy walk up to me, actually, Richard, it was in Philadelphia where I met you for the second or third time.
Right.
When Travis Walton was there.
This was in it was in Philly in I think the end of 2011. I think it might have been New Year's Eve 2011.
Right. Yeah, 11 or 12, whenever it was. It was at that convention. Guy walked up to me and he sat down. He was talking to me and he said, "You know what he thinks that oil was?"
What?
It was some type of a lubrication oil that was inside of the craft that lubricated the body of the monster because it was some type of a coolant lubrication. It was nothing to do with the machine. He says, I think that was a reptilian snake or something, whatever the hell was in there. and that was like a jelly lubricant type thing on its body. And when that thing sprung a leak, it was actually sitting inside of this lubricant.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That would make a little more sense to me, as crazy as that might sound to someone who's never followed this at all. That's actually a little bit more credible than thinking it's how this thing maneuvered or it's part of its propulsion system. Because you just don't think of hot oil with helping a UFO to operate in some way or another, or at least part of its technology. So that's interesting. All right, Frank, so, yes, I'm sorry, you want to say something else? I'm cutting you off.
No, and it made sense to me because I've wondered that myself. And it was an oil-like substance.
Right.
Oil-like substance.
Which we can assume was examined and analyzed at great length in a classified setting, and we don't have those results, obviously. So that's interesting.
Nope.
Well, Frank, look, let's end this segment. I think that you and I are going to have more to talk about. We've given listeners a lot to chew on. Can we come back with one more interview, at least so we can talk maybe even off the record? But I don't want to end this completely. I just want to end this segment here with you right now.
Yeah, sure. We got a lot to talk about, Richard.
So let me just say
this was kind of a synopsis. We can go in depth a little bit more into it.
There's much more. So this will conclude this segment of my interview with Frank Feschino, and we've been talking about the Flatwoods Monster case in great detail. If you want to hear us continue this conversation, go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where Frank and I are going to go even a little bit further. Frank, this has been wonderful. I really want to thank you for these two incredible segments so far of the Flatwoods Monster explication, everything you've done on it. It's been great.
Thanks for having me on, Richard.
And I want to thank you for listening. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.